What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors comes face to face with television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Benedict Cumberbatch sits down with Piers Morgan on Uncensored, expecting a civilized discussion about his latest projects, only to find himself in the crosshairs of one of the most explosive confrontations in recent television history. The night that was supposed to showcase Cumberbatch's upcoming film turns into a verbal battleground that ends with security being called, and cameras still rolling as one of Hollywood's most respected stars storms off set. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in what starts as friendly banter and escalates into television chaos. The atmosphere in the Uncensored studio felt different from the moment Benedict Cumberbatch walked onto the set. Fresh off promoting his latest film, the acclaimed actor appeared relaxed, dressed in his signature tailored suit, flashing that characteristic smile that had charmed audiences worldwide. Piers Morgan, positioned behind his imposing desk, with that familiar smirk playing across his face, seemed unusually animated as the cameras prepared to roll. What none of the studio audience knew was that Morgan had spent the afternoon scrolling through social media, increasingly agitated by what he perceived as Cumberbatch's recent political statements regarding British media ethics. "Benedict, wonderful to have you here," Morgan began with deceptive warmth as the interview commenced, his voice carrying that distinctive edge that regular viewers had come to recognize as a warning sign. "You look fantastic, very dapper as always. Now, before we talk about your new film, I have to ask about something that's been bothering me." Cumberbatch's eyebrows raised slightly, a practiced smile still in place, but those observant eyes already showing the first flicker of wariness. Morgan leaned forward, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. "You've been quite vocal lately about media responsibility, haven't you? Quite the crusader for journalistic integrity." The way he emphasized crusader carried an unmistakable mocking undertone that caused Cumberbatch to straighten in his chair. "I mean, that's rich coming from someone in your position, isn't it?" "I'm not sure I follow, Piers," Cumberbatch replied carefully, his cultured voice maintaining its composure even as his posture became more guarded. "If you're referring to my comments about the importance of factual reporting and the responsibility that comes with having a platform, then yes, I believe that's something we should all care about." Morgan's laugh was sharp, cutting through the studio air like a blade. "Oh, come on, Benedict. Don't play naive with me. You've made quite a few pointed comments about certain broadcasters, certain journalists. Care to elaborate on who exactly you think is so irresponsible?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now, and several crew members exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Cumberbatch's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained level. "I've spoken generally about the need for media accountability. Yes. In an era where misinformation can spread rapidly and cause real harm, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in public positions to consider the impact of our words and the platforms we choose to legitimize." "The platforms we choose to legitimize," Morgan repeated slowly, savoring each word. "That's interesting phrasing, Benedict. Very interesting indeed. Because I can't help but wonder if that's a veiled criticism of shows like this one. Are you suggesting that by appearing here tonight, you're somehow compromising your precious principles?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees as the full implication of Morgan's words hit home. Cumberbatch's composure cracked slightly, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his refined features. "That's quite a leap, Piers. I'm here to discuss my work and engage in meaningful dialogue. If you're looking for controversy where none exists, perhaps that says more about your approach to journalism than mine to acting." Morgan's eyes gleamed with the predatory satisfaction of someone who had just spotted blood in the water. "My approach to journalism? Oh, that's precious. Tell me, Benedict, when exactly did you become such an expert on journalism? Was it between playing Sherlock Holmes, or perhaps during your stint as a wizard?" "Because I've been doing this for 30 years, and I find it rather amusing when actors start lecturing real journalists about how to do their jobs." The condescension in Morgan's voice was so thick it was practically tangible, and Cumberbatch's grip on his composure began to visibly slip. His usually warm demeanor cooled considerably as he leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a steelier edge. "I may be an actor, Piers, but I'm also a citizen who cares about the quality of public discourse. And frankly, I'm starting to understand why so many of your colleagues have distanced themselves from your methods. My methods? Morgan's voice rose sharply, his face flushing with indignation. What exactly are you implying, Benedict? Because if you have something to say about how I conduct my interviews, perhaps you should have the courage to say it directly instead of hiding behind these sanctimonious generalities. Cumberbatch's eyes flashed dangerously, his carefully maintained public persona beginning to crack under Morgan's relentless provocation. Fine. Since you insist on directness, I'm suggesting that ambushing guests with hostile questioning, designed purely for entertainment value rather than genuine inquiry, isn't journalism. It's sensationalism masquerading as news. The studio fell deadly quiet except for the hum of cameras still rolling, capturing every charged moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most uncomfortable interviews in recent memory. Morgan's face had gone from flushed to nearly purple, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he processed what amounted to a direct attack on his professional credibility on live television. Sensationalism? Morgan's voice was barely controlled now, trembling with barely suppressed rage. You come on to my show, accept my hospitality, and then have the unmitigated gall to sit there and insult everything I've built, everything I've worked for? But before Cumberbatch could respond, Morgan was already launching into his next assault, and what happened next would push this confrontation past the point of no return. You know what I find absolutely fascinating, Benedict? Morgan's voice dripped with venom as he pulled out his phone, waving it like a weapon. You talk about media responsibility, about factual reporting, but let's talk about your own relationship with the truth, shall we? Because I've done my homework tonight. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably as Morgan's voice grew louder, more aggressive. You've been very selective about which interviews you give, haven't you? Very careful about controlling your narrative? Cumberbatch's face darkened, his usually impeccable composure finally beginning to fracture under the sustained assault. I'm selective about the quality of discourse I engage in, yes. And right now, I'm beginning to question my judgment in that regard. Oh, brilliant! Morgan slammed his hand on the desk, causing several crew members to jump. There it is! The arrogance, the superiority complex. You think you're better than this show, better than me, better than the millions of people who watch this program every night. His voice had risen to near shouting levels, spittle flying as he leaned forward aggressively. Well, let me tell you something, Benedict. Your high-minded principles don't give you the right to come on my show and lecture me about my profession. The actor's hands clenched into fists on his lap, his knuckles white with tension. I'm not lecturing anyone, Piers. I'm simply stating that there's a difference between holding people accountable and creating unnecessary conflict for ratings. What you're doing right now proves my point perfectly. Morgan's eyes blazed with fury as he stood up from his chair, towering over his guest in what could only be described as an intimidation tactic. What I'm doing right now is my job. I ask the hard questions that other interviewers are too cowardly to ask. I challenge my guests instead of fawning over them like some star-struck fan. His voice echoed through the studio as security guards began moving closer to the set, sensing the volatile situation spiraling out of control. Hard questions? Cumberbatch shot back, his own voice rising now, as his famous composure finally shattered completely. You call personal attacks and manufactured controversy hard questions? You're not a journalist, Piers. You're a provocateur who's confused conflict with content. The studio audience gasped audibly as the beloved actor's mask of politeness disintegrated entirely. Morgan's face went scarlet, his voice reaching a crescendo of rage. How dare you? How bloody dare you sit there and question my credentials? I've interviewed world leaders, covered wars, broken stories that mattered when you were still prancing around in student theater. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at Cumberbatch's face. You're nothing but a privileged actor who thinks his fame gives him the right to judge real professionals. Real professionals? Cumberbatch was on his feet now, matching Morgan's aggressive posture. Real professionals don't ambush their guests. They don't turn interviews into gladiatorial combat for entertainment. What you do isn't journalism, it's exploitation. His usually refined accent had taken on a harder edge, years of public relations training completely abandoned in the face of Morgan's relentless assault. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing, facing off across the interview desk like prizefighters ready to throw punches. The studio crew watched in stunned silence as two of Britain's most prominent media figures engaged in what could only be described as a verbal bloodbath. Morgan's face was twisted with rage, his hands shaking as he pointed accusingly at his guest. Exploitation? You want to talk about exploitation? Morgan's voice cracked with fury. You exploit your reputation, your posh accent, your classical training to look down on people like me who actually work for a living. You live in your ivory tower, making your art house films and collecting your awards, while real journalists get their hands dirty reporting actual news. Cumberbatch's eyes flashed dangerously, his composure now completely shattered. Don't you dare lecture me about work ethic, and don't you dare suggest that entertainment has no value. What I do requires skill, dedication, and yes, sometimes it even requires truth, something you might want to try incorporating into your approach. The studio atmosphere had become suffocating, tension crackling between the two men like electricity. Morgan stepped closer to his guest, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than his shouting had. You want truth, Benedict? Here's some truth for you. You're exactly the kind of entitled, sanctimonious celebrity who thinks their opinion matters more than everyone else's. You parade around talking about responsibility while living in a bubble completely disconnected from reality. At least I don't make a career out of destroying people's reputations for sport. Cumberbatch fired back, his voice shaking with anger. At least I don't invite people onto my show just to humiliate them in front of millions of viewers. The accusation hung in the air like a blade, cutting through whatever pretense of civility had remained. Morgan's response was swift and brutal, his voice reaching a volume that seemed to shake the studio walls. If you can't handle the heat, then why did you accept the invitation? Nobody forced you to come here, Benedict. Nobody put a gun to your precious head and made you sit in that chair. His face was now inches from Cumberbatch's. The two men separated only by the interview desk. But what Morgan said next would be the final straw. The words that would end this confrontation in the most dramatic way possible. You know what your real problem is, Benedict? Morgan's voice turned cold and calculating, his eyes glinting with malicious intent. You're terrified that people might see through your carefully constructed persona and realize you're just another mediocre actor who got lucky because of your connections and your posh background. That's why you hide behind all this intellectual posturing. Because deep down, you know you're not half as talented as people think you are. The words hit Cumberbatch like a physical blow, his face going white with shock and rage. The studio fell into absolute silence, even the camera operators stopping their movements as they witnessed what amounted to a character assassination on live television. For a moment, the acclaimed actor stood frozen, processing the sheer cruelty of Morgan's attack. That's enough, Cumberbatch said quietly, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. That is absolutely enough. He began removing his microphone with trembling hands, his movements sharp and deliberate. I came here tonight expecting to have a conversation about my work, about cinema, about things that actually matter. Instead, I've been subjected to a sustained personal attack designed purely for your entertainment. Morgan, sensing that his guest was preparing to leave, doubled down with vicious determination. Oh, running away now, are we? Can't handle a little honest criticism? This is exactly what I'm talking about, Benedict. You celebrities live in such a protected bubble that the moment someone challenges you, you fall apart. Cumberbatch's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made several crew members step back. Honest criticism? You call personal insults and character assassination honest criticism? He stood to his full height, his voice growing stronger and more commanding with each word. Let me tell you what honest criticism looks like, Piers. You are a bully who has built an entire career on the misery of others. You invite people onto this show not to engage in meaningful dialogue, but to humiliate them for the entertainment of your audience. The host's face twisted with rage as he realized he was losing control of the situation. How dare you, he began. But Cumberbatch cut him off with a raised hand and a voice that could have filled the Old Vic Theatre. No, I'm talking now. You've had your chance to speak, and you've used it to show everyone exactly what kind of person you really are. Cumberbatch's voice carried the full weight of his classical training, projecting to every corner of the studio with devastating clarity. You talk about real journalism, about hard questions, but what you practice isn't journalism at all. It's sadism dressed up as entertainment. You don't inform your audience. You poison them with cynicism and cruelty. Morgan attempted to interrupt again, his face now purple with indignation, but Cumberbatch's voice rose to drown him out completely. You want to know why so many of your former colleagues won't work with you anymore? Why respected journalists distance themselves from your methods? Because they recognize that what you do debases the entire profession. You've turned news into blood sport, and you've confused ratings with relevance. The studio was completely captivated now, watching as one of Britain's most beloved actors delivered what amounted to a masterclass in righteous anger. Even the security guards had stopped moving, transfixed by the raw power of Cumberbatch's performance. This wasn't just an angry celebrity having a meltdown. This was a man defending his principles with eloquent fury. And as for your pathetic attempt to question my talent, Cumberbatch continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more power than shouting, I've spent my entire career earning the respect of my peers through hard work and dedication. I don't need to destroy others to build myself up. I don't need to humiliate guests to feel important. That's the difference between us, Piers. I create things that matter, while you simply tear down what others have built. Morgan's attempts to regain control of his own show were becoming increasingly desperate. This is my show, he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. You don't get to come here and… Your show? Cumberbatch's laugh was sharp and bitter. This isn't a show, Piers. This is a circus, and you're the ringmaster of cruelty. Well, congratulations. You've finally pushed someone too far. I hope the ratings were worth it, because this is exactly the kind of behavior that's destroying public discourse in this country. With that, Cumberbatch began walking toward the exit, his movements deliberate and dignified, despite the chaos erupting around him. Morgan, realizing that his most high-profile guest in months was about to storm off on live television, began shouting after him with increasing desperation. You can't just walk out. We're live. Benedict, get back here. But his protests fell on deaf ears as Cumberbatch continued his measured march toward the studio doors. The actor paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time to deliver his parting shot. I came here tonight believing in the possibility of civil discourse, even with someone whose methods I disagree with. You've proven that belief to be naive. This isn't journalism, Piers. It's exactly the kind of toxic behavior that's poisoning our media landscape. I won't be part of it. Morgan's final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation was perhaps the most pathetic moment of the entire confrontation. Fine. Go running back to your Hollywood friends. This is what real journalism looks like. Asking the questions that matter. Cumberbatch paused in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the corridor lights. No, Piers, he said with quiet dignity that cut through the studio noise like a blade. This is what failure looks like. And the truly sad part is that you don't even realize it. With those words, Benedict Cumberbatch walked out of the studio, leaving behind a host whose face was a mask of fury and humiliation, a stunned crew, and an audience that had just witnessed one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. The cameras continued rolling as Morgan stood alone behind his desk, his show in shambles and his reputation taking yet another devastating blow in front of millions of viewers who had just seen exactly what happens when theatrical bullying meets principled resistance. The silence that followed Cumberbatch's exit was deafening, broken only by the mechanical hum of cameras that had captured every devastating moment of Morgan's complete and utter defeat.